Okay, we are live, and welcome to my guest this evening. I am going to read your introduction because I know I will get this wrong, if you don't mind. So I said in the description to this video that everyone who uses X and has an inkling of what's going on in China will recognize my next guest. He works at the intersection of intersection of digital innovation and technologies and international political economy, with a focus on the implications, possibilities, and dynamics of distributed ledger and blockchain technologies. What does that all mean? It means he has a focus on things such as digital payment, data integrity, and supply chains, including food systems. And he describes himself as having a particular interest in the place of China in the future of international economic and social systems. So let's welcome Adjunct Professor Warwick Powell of Queensland University of Technology. Welcome, Warwick, and thank you for joining me this evening.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you, Jerry, and with all of your followers and fans and anyone else who might have stumbled in upon our chat tonight.
Yeah, we do get a few stumble in, and I think they come in for a little while and then disappear, but there's a few people such as already in there who are very, very regulars. So let's, without any further ado, because I know that you're in Australia now, right?
I am, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So you're 2 hours ahead of us now, so it's already 9 p.m. Let's not make this too late a night for you, if that's all right. My original interest in speaking with you was to talk about whether Australia will support the applications for accession to the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. What a name. And I think probably my question was, will Australia support the Republic of China? Will it support Taiwan? Or will it support both or neither? And what international pressures do you think will be brought to bear on Australia for its support? So let's start with that question.
Look, big question. In many ways, Jerry, the jury's out. I mean, in a sense, who knows? Mm-hmm. And in large part, it's because the context that we're in at the moment, in early 2024, is crisscrossed by a lot of noise, a lot of political noise, a lot of geopolitical noise, both domestically and also at an international level, which in many ways clouds the decision-making framework that would normally be brought to bear on these sorts of things. Let's put it into a bit of context, I guess. China and Australia are massive trading partners.
Yes.
In fact, from Australia's point of view, China is, without a doubt, its largest trading partner, with bilateral trade values exceeding $200 billion last year, a record high. China is also a significant trading nation, period, and how it interacts globally as a trading nation has implications for other trading nations, because it can affect markets, it can open new markets, it can dominate markets purely through scale.
Yes.
And so ensuring that China remains a constructive participant in the global trading system is actually in the interest of countries like Australia. So from a national interest point of view, there's lots of good reasons why Australia should want China to be involved in as many bilateral, and of course it can only be in one with Australia, single bilateral agreement, chapter, but as many free trade and other kinds of multilateral institutions as possible. China already is a member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which came into effect a couple of years ago. And that's actually, and Australia's a member of it too. So 15 nations, 10 ASEAN members, plus China, Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia and New Zealand are all members of RCEP, which is actually the world's largest free trade agreement in terms of the amount of trade conducted between the participating members. And given that membership of RCEP was something that Australia was keen to do for itself, but also keen for China, obviously, to be involved. I think that lays the groundwork really for expanding the ways in which China participates in multilateral trade arrangements. So with a bit of luck, good trade public policy will prevail. The pressure, of course, is that the CPTPP is a creature of geopolitics. The Obama administration proposed a TPP, and when Trump came in, he took the US out of it, and in many ways stripped the TPP of its real grunt. Market access to the US market is something that most trading nations would hope to be able to get. And by Trump taking the US out of it, it really stripped the TPP of anything of real substance. Nonetheless, a few of the countries that were keen to join that reconfigured it and gave it this clumsy new name. And the US is still not in it. And of course, it's now used as a bit of a rhetorical football, if you will, where language like, well, it's a very high standard trading environment, and we're not sure that so and so is able to meet these high standards, etc., etc. And in many ways, there's a little sense of superiority about it all. We've got the top-notch trade agreement, and we're not sure whether the riffraff should be let in. There's a little bit of that, and so let's see. As for the question of Taiwan, well, it'd be playing with fire, I guess, for countries like Australia that don't recognise Taiwan as a sovereign nation in and of its own right to admit it to a trade agreement. Obviously, participating countries need to arrive at a consensus, Jerry, and that's always a difficult thing to do, of course, in a geopolitically hot environment. So
I spoke to Shiro Armstrong the other day, and he mentioned, I asked the same question of him, and he mentioned that apart from one interesting aspect where he said, and he did say, I could quote him on this, free trade agreements are very much a political trophy. They're not a real thing. They're just a trophy, because when the relationship is good, you get the trade anyway, and you can do all sorts of deals. And really, it's just a thing to hang on the wall and say, look what we've achieved. But apart from that, he did say that he felt China coming in to the CPTPP would be a very beneficial thing for the rest of the group, because it would force China to comply with a higher standard than the World Trade Organization rules. Do you think that's true?
Well, this is the point, isn't it? If you believe that an actor should shift their behavior and they want to be involved in a particular organization of some sort, and that has a set of behavioral standards, and that's the logical step, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
You join us and you behave according to these rules, and all is good. That's the mutual beneficial opportunity, I guess. Look, I'm not entirely convinced about. I think that there is something to say about FTAs being trophies that you stick on a wall, but there is something very interesting actually in the academic literature about the relationship between trade and the state of, let's call it, diplomatic relations. And in fact, there is no clear positive relationship between the two. In fact, there is substantial evidence which shows that even when diplomatic relationships are quite rocky, trade prevails, and that in fact, when there is an expectation that diplomatic relationships might get a little bit rockier in the not too distant future, you tend to see upticks in the amount of trade because businesses tend to stock up on things. But at some point, I guess, if diplomatic relationships become, reaches a certain threshold point and they become very, very sour, then that does affect your ability to do things with each other. But that threshold is actually quite high. Things have actually got to be quite bad before, trade actually stops. And we saw that actually in the last 5 or 6 years in terms of the tensions that existed diplomatically between Australia and China, that from a value point of view, Australian exports actually continued to do a roaring trade, notwithstanding those categories that were specifically identified and excluded from the trade, arrangements. But so they are trophies, but at the same time, they are ways of sustaining interactions when things aren't great.
Well, that's also true because Australia and China have a free trade agreement and have since December 2015. So we're coming close to 10 years with that. And that you're right, it didn't actually affect trade overall. It affected coal, short-term coal. It affected barley for a long time, about 3 years. Wine is still under some kind of scrutiny. Lobsters are back. We're getting lobsters here. We've got a whole heap of things coming in from Australia that were supposedly banned, but they never have been. I think there was a problem with timber too, but that was some kind of infestation that was caught before it arrived. So there's reasons for most of them, and trade between our two countries. I call China our country because I'm here rather than because it's my country. But the trade between us really continued unabated in pretty much every other category, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing to remember is how sticky trade relationships are. And they're sticky for lots of reasons, in part because the effort and costs that go into actually establishing them in the first place are quite high. And the relationships are of high value, and to abandon all of that at the drop of a hat is a very, very costly thing to do from an enterprise's point of view. It can take many years to cultivate the relationships that you need to have successful market entry channels, to build brand awareness, brand presence, brand reputations, and all those sorts of things. And you're not going to walk away from that just because the folk in the political blob, so to speak, are having a conniption over something.
Yeah. There's a few comments coming in that China plans to defund AUKUS. I don't think that's going to happen. China doesn't really have much of a say in AUKUS. And really, China will continue its trade. The way I see China working is it never really defaults on anything. It changes rules, but it doesn't default on anything. And someone says China isn't a member of the RCEP. I think that's wrong. They are a member of the RCEP.
Yeah, China's a member of the RCEP.
Found a member of RCEP as well.
Yeah.
Let's move on off the CPTPP because none of us can remember the acronym. Let's move on to Indonesian nickel mining. This is something that you sent me the other day. Wow, this is interesting. China has helped overcome what some might call the shackles of colonialism. I think that was your word, the shackles of colonialism. But the World Trade Organization doesn't agree. What's the problem in Indonesia with Indonesian nickel mining right now?
Well, basically, the Indonesian government not so long ago banned the export of nickel on the basis that selling nickel raw was not optimizing the economic opportunities for Indonesia. And by banning it, it sought to leverage a rich natural resource base to attract those with the capital and the know-how to develop downstream processing. Nickel refining is an expensive industry to set up, and not anybody can go and do it. In fact, I had some interactions with the world of nickel some years ago, in large part because in the north of Queensland, where I am, there's a significant nickel refinery which would import the raw materials from New Caledonia and sometimes from Indonesia and refine it and then send off final product. So it's an expensive process to set up. It requires considerable engineering and technical know-how and chemical know-how. And of course, there are a whole lot of environmental issues in terms of nickel refining as well. But Indonesia's worldview, I guess, is that for a long time, the developing world, rich in natural resources, have largely had their natural resources stripped and the value add undertaken elsewhere. And the Indonesian government sought to put an end to that. Now, the WTO was unhappy about it, in large part because one of the other, client customers basically, that used to buy the nickel from Indonesia complained. And I think they prevailed, right? But in the meantime, whilst all of that happened, Chinese capital and know-how came in and established some downstream processing facilities, and is enabling the Indonesian economy now to benefit from having localized processing and value adding. So from the point of view of Indonesia, I think it achieved for the time being what it sought to achieve. And the WTO's position in the end is something of a Pyrrhic victory.
Yeah. Do you think that Australia could do the same thing with something like bauxite or aluminium? They've got huge resources, but they ship it all to China. China turns it, and iron ore as well. China turns it into the finished product and ships it back so they can build things and use it for things. Yeah, look,
I mean, Australia does have some downstream processing in the mineral space. You know, it's had some steel manufacturing historically. It's got copper processing, though some of that I think is likely to shut down. I think in the next 2 years in Townsville, there's been some announcements made about that. There are some challenges for Australia in terms of downstream processing. Everyone always talks about having downstream processing in Australia, but the question you always have to ask yourself is, notwithstanding the ambition that has been articulated for many years, why hasn't it happened? Some people will say it's because governments don't provide enough support for it. And I guess there's a political argument that people have in this country, Australia, about the extent to which governments should or shouldn't provide financial support to industry. And for the past 20, 30 years or so, I guess the prevailing winds have largely been to shy away from direct government financing and direct government subsidies of industry. They do it in other ways, I guess. So, look, I mean, again, you've got to build a business case. You know, ultimately,
it's also a dirty business, isn't it? So you mentioned the environmental issues, and I think that's something Australia would like to avoid. It's one thing to make money, but it's another thing to pollute. And this is what China did for 30 or 40 years. It polluted its own country by doing that.
Well, take rare earths, right? So rare earths, which aren't particularly rare, incidentally, but when they were first called rare earths, when they were first discovered, they were thought to be rare. But
they're not.
But the rare earths industry in China actually grew many decades ago, in large part because rare earth mining and processing in Western countries like America didn't want to continue doing that kind of work in the US and took it to China because it was dirty, it was environmentally damaging, it was hazardous to humans, the workers themselves, but it was better to do it in a place that had low standards environmentally and all of that sort of thing. And so the paradoxical outcome, Jerry, of all of that, 30, 40 years ago, is that today the collective West is moaning that it doesn't have any of it. And in large part, it's because it's sent it all to China.
And now they're moaning that China's controlling it. It's what they wanted originally.
It's what they wanted, right? And so through the passages of time, a lot of decisions that get made at a particular moment in time come back to bite you, or they come back to haunt you. And in many regards, things like, particularly in the rare earth space, the decisions to not take on the risks of the hazards of environmental impacts and workforce impacts and human safety and all of that, has actually led to the situation today. It is what it is.
Yeah, yeah. Someone's asked this question, and I wasn't even aware of this. This is completely off topic, and we're going to shift into this. I didn't know that President Marcos had been invited to address Australia's parliament. I missed that little piece of news. How important is President Marcos, bang, bang, bong, bong, to Australia?
Look, Australia needs to intensify its engagements across Southeast Asia. The government released a policy not so long ago in relation to Australia's approach to Southeast Asia. And in a macro sense, you know, the fact that Southeast Asia is now on Australia's policy map is a good thing. There's no doubt that Australia has had in some ways, a difficult relationship with the region, not in terms of any particularly high levels of anxieties or conflicts and those sorts of things, though there have been some, you know, in terms of East Timor and West Papua and those sorts of things. But Australia's identity, I guess, has always been open to question in terms of the relationship between history and geography. And being what is in effect a relatively modern colonial country settled by the English, and settled in inverted commas, Australia has been situated geographically in Asia, but has never been really a part of Asia. And reaching out, I guess, and trying to cultivate relationships with Asian nations is a good thing from Australia's point of view, I think. And I think it's also generally a good thing from the region's point of view too, in that the region needs to be able to advocate or express its views to Australia, a long-term ally of the United States, incidentally, and the Philippines is too, right? So in a sense, even though it's an Asian nation, the Philippines is also an American ally, right, with expanding military agreements and those sorts of things. So, you know, there's a few stars are lining up, if you will, in terms of the Philippines president coming to Australia. There are some aligned interests at the moment, both geopolitically in terms of the relationship to the US as a security guarantor, if you will, in the region from the point of view of these two countries. But I'd also hope that these relationships are more than just that. And if an Australian government can actually convert good intentions around deepening its economic, social, and cultural engagements with Asia generally, and convert that intention into concrete actions, then, you know, that's a good thing.
It's a good thing for all, yeah. Paul Keating was a big fan of that as well back in the day, and quite outspoken on it quite recently as well. He's made a lot of people in China quite happy, I think.
Look, there was a window of time in Australia's recent history between, say 1995 1985 to 1995. There was a very interesting window because many things about Australia that had been pretty much locked in stone began to get turned on its head in that 10-year window. White Australia, of course, was abandoned the decade earlier, and tariffs began to come down from the days of Whitlam. But in terms of Australians' economic policies, that period was transformative. You know, some people will be critical of some of the extents to which the Labor governments of that time privatised assets and all those sorts of things. But from an external posture point of view, the governments of the time were very much about opening up the Australian economy to the world, and to do that with confidence in the capacity of Australian workers and businesses to adapt to what that openness would mean. The other thing that happened during that period was a recognition that Australia's economic future, and indeed because of its economic future, its future security, would have to come from engaging with Asia. So in 1988, a report was prepared for the Commonwealth government by a leading academic, a guy called Ross Garnaut, and Garnaut's still around today, which spoke to the rise of North Asia, predominantly Japan and Korea, and touched on China. By 1991, 92 or thereabouts, there was more reports, not with people's names attached to them, but sort of driven out of the bureaucracy in Canberra on foreign affairs and trade, which identified South China also as a critical trading gateway for Australia. And come 1993, the Council of Australian Governments tasked Queensland with the responsibility of preparing a report on the role of Asian languages and cultures education in Australian schools from the perspective of advancing Australia's economic interests. And I was involved in drafting that report.
Right.
The report was known as the Rudd Report in the end, because Kevin was the chair of the working group that pulled the report together on behalf of the Queensland government. And that report identified 4 core languages that, and there's no surprises what they are: Mandarin, Bahasa Indonesian, Korean, and Japanese. To be taught as mandatory requirements for Australian school children from the age of 9 upwards. And Kevin ran around the countryside, meeting with counterparts and education ministers and treasurers at state and Commonwealth levels during the course of this process, and secured bipartisan Commonwealth and state agreements to fund the recommendations of the report, which was essentially about $1 billion a year, half from the Commonwealth and half from the states and territories, to train up a cohort of teachers. Because the first thing we realised was, if we want to put all these kids through,
you've got to have someone to teach them.
You've got to have teachers. So there was no teachers, not enough teachers. So you had to fund that, etc., etc. Now that secured funding from, I think, 95 through to 2002. And in 2002, the then government canned it, and Asian languages initiatives across the country lost strategic focus and fragmented to sort of state levels. So there's this window of time where Australia was working very hard to orient itself and deeply engage with the region to become a participant in the region, not just a country that was located in the region that sort of did stuff with the region, but to become an engaged participant in the region. Now, Keating in 95 also did the first defence deal with Suharto in Indonesia as part of that government's sensibility towards needing to secure the country's security in Asia rather than from Asia. Now that window closed. I read a report recently that spoke of Australia's peak Asian literacy as being achieved in around 2002, and it's been sliding ever since. And it's sliding in large part because we don't have the numbers of people coming through the education systems, developing those knowledges, the language skills, the cultural sensibilities, and those sorts of things. And so a generation of opportunity in that sense has been lost. In some part, I think that the problems that have emerged between Australia and China in the last 10 years, or at least the space in which those problems could get magnified, is in part attributable to the fact that we lost a generation of deep Asian competency. Yes, there are people who understand Asia, but in terms of it seeping through the social body, to have people across industry, across social organisations and deep into society that actually has a deep and meaningful knowledge and appreciation of Asia and Australia's relationship to it and place in it. Because we didn't do that, come the time to ramp up the scare campaigns and the fear campaigns and the risk and the threats and all of those things, in a sense, to lift the scab off Australia's tawdry 200 plus years of xenophobia and let that come oozing back out. Well, that was easy to do. And it's because we stopped investing as a country in our capacity to be part of Asia.
That makes sense. Let's move on to one of those threats. I know you're a big proponent for China as for dialogue, for interaction, rather than for fear. There's a lot of people afraid of China. We can come on to ASPI and things like that if we have time later. But I wanted to touch on the debt trap diplomacy, which China is accused of. They're accused of helping. And the Indonesian thing was one of those, the nickel mining. They're only doing it so they can get soft power. They're only doing it so that they can eventually take control because the country can't afford to repay it. What's your take on this debt trap diplomacy that China is often accused of?
I'll come to the debt trap stuff specifically in a moment, but think about how the rhetorical structure works here. It actually doesn't matter what China does.
It's true.
The sense that the angle will be some kind of a criticism, and it's always about motive and intent. Okay, so if China does something, it's because it's got nefarious intent. But if China doesn't do something, it's because it's stupid, right? And it's lost its opportunity, right? Yeah. And yet the presupposition in almost all of this space is that nations supposedly work on the basis of advancing their interests. They've got some sense of national interest, whatever that happens to be, and that they're seeking to advance that. Now, what counts as national interest, I think, is actually something that's quite broad and isn't identical from country to country, because different countries bring different experiences to the table in terms of actually understanding what their interests are, not just today, but what they may be in 10 years or 20 years or 200 years' time. Right? So time frames actually affect how you even think about this question of interests. In terms of this question of debt trap diplomacy, it's a great throwaway line. And the one thing that I think the mainstream media and the scaremongers and stuff are exceptionally good at is working up a little one-liner that resonates with social media and all those sorts of things.
Sorry, I brought that up too early.
but the academic literature, which actually addresses these issues seriously, as opposed to in a point-scoring kind of way, is actually pretty clear. Deborah Brautigam in the United States
I was going to ask about her. Yeah,
has decades of experience in China-Africa relationships.
Mostly Africa, yeah.
And she began that work before China and Africa even became a popular thing, right? She's been deeply immersed in this space of development economics and development finance for a number of decades. And her work and the work of her research team and the institute that she established around her work is actually conclusive. This debt trap diplomacy stuff is a fabrication, an absolute fabrication. Creditors, of course, require some guarantees from somebody when they make loans. That's actually unsurprising. There isn't a Western creditor that doesn't insist on guarantees and securities. The IMF does, you name it. So there's nothing controversial about that. But here's the interesting thing. Last November, I caught up with some folk in Beijing who largely retired now, but they were senior figures in the legal and cross-border finance environment when Chinese banks were starting to provide a lot of finance internationally. And what they told me was that the bankers were complaining that all the projects that came before them were actually high-risk projects. And it's because all of the low-risk projects were already being banked by
the low-hanging fruits.
All the low-hanging fruit was already taken care of. And yet the message was, go forth and provide finance support. So what did they do? Well, in the end, a lot of these projects typically involve Chinese corporate partners working with counterparts in the developing countries. The money was lent, and the guarantees were actually provided by the Chinese corporate partner.
Oh, instead of the country, the nation.
Instead of the entity in the country in which the project was being undertaken. It was the only way that these banks would actually provide the finance. So the person that is most under pressure is actually the Chinese project partner, not the project itself.
There was a very interesting comment made, I think it was by one of the Saudi Arabian leaders, about the fact that China is lending money, yes, and it is putting infrastructure into places. But the interesting thing is, even if it all collapses, the infrastructure stays there. They've still got a road, they've still got a train line, they've still got a port, they've still got a hospital or a school. And that actually is a fact, whereas over years of colonialism, all they got was more and more poverty, it seems.
Yeah, and where they did have rail lines, of course, they were of different gauges that didn't fit together anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
But the thing is about this hard infrastructure is, yes, you know, it's physically going to still be there. But when you finance a project like this, take a road or a railroad or something, it's premised on the idea that it's going to have a certain amount of utilization.
Right.
And that there'll be a certain pricing regime around it. You know, you're charged by the container or charged by the truck or charged by the ton or whatever it happens to be. And that will then be built into a financial model which will enable the lender to recoup interest and principal over the defined period of the loan, whether it's 20 years or 30 years or whatever. Now, often the expectations around the cash flow volume that comes through these facilities is not as high as people thought it was going to be. In other words, it's not going to be able to repay its loans within, say, the 20 years or 30 years. So what happens? Well, from the lender's point of view, you actually just restructure the loan.
Yeah.
Right? You restructure the
Either
loan.
restructure it or write it off, which China has done a lot of too.
Well, sometimes you write it off too, right? But you can restructure it in lots of different ways. And so, in effect, refinance it. And so you don't need to somehow turn this into this point scoring exercise around debt traps and all of that. What you've got to look at is the extent to which these facilities and the infrastructure that ends up being built enables new economic activity to take place in a place that previously didn't have it. And if instead of taking 20 years to recoup the original investment, it takes you 30, well, so what? In the end, so what, right? The bottom line is that it's been transformative
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the transformation itself creates new economic opportunities. So
Exactly the same thing could be said
yes,
of China's own infrastructure. I've seen so many criticisms about the high-speed rail, but that is transformative. You've probably been on it yourself. I've been on it dozens, maybe hundreds of times now. It is absolutely transformative. People who couldn't get around are now getting around. Regions that weren't accessible are now more accessible. Trade that wasn't possible is now possible, or because of this thing which people say it's losing money. It isn't. It's gaining the country money. It's gaining the people money. The line might be losing money, but generally speaking, I don't think it is anyway.
Well, on the social balance sheet, it's not losing money.
Correct.
And but again, it's a great example, right? An infrastructure network is built. It makes the movement of lots of people across a big country quicker and easier and more accessible and cheaper and all those sorts of things. And of course, there's this sort of line of criticism, which is that it's inefficient. It's overbuilt, too much infrastructure. Shouldn't have had so much infrastructure. But the rub is that if China didn't build this infrastructure, the same people would be criticizing China for neglecting its people. Look at them. Poor,
Yes.
hopeless, disconnected. They don't have electricity in the village. Fact of the matter is that in a big country, both geographically and population-wise, if the national objective is to enable people across the country, wherever they live, to be connected to the broader economic system through roads, through electricity, through data networks, through railroads, through aeroplanes, boats, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is all about enabling people and places to be connected into systems of flow, right? Because flow, the movement of value through this economic system, is actually the lifeblood of societies. And having groups of people stuck in the mountains where it takes you a week to come down to the market and a week to go back is no way to improve the standard of living of those people.
Mm.
So, when you build a national network, the other thing to remember is that that network is going to be doing its thing for decades upon decades upon decades. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to make money this year. It's going to continue to help society.
And here's the other one, right? The flip side is this, and you see this a lot more in Western countries where there is a never-ending stream of criticisms of governments for not having the foresight to do things. Now,
including probably Australia.
Absolutely. I've seen over and over again, whenever the government does something and it's not really very well patronised for 5 years or 10 years, the usual naysayers come out. This new road or whatever it is, hopeless. No one's using it, right? Hopeless. But of course, if you didn't build it, in 20 years' time, when all the other roads are congested, someone will pipe up and say, they should have built the road. Where was the foresight?
Yeah. So damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And there's too much of that. There's just too much of this stuff.
There always is. And particularly, it's not just in relation to China's governance, but it's in relation to any government. Every pub expert will sit with his arm in the bar, drinking his schooner or his middy or his stubby or whatever it is, saying, I could have done that so much better. And I think that's the armchair critic in all of us, I guess. Let's move on to a different kind of infrastructure. I'm going to bring up this picture that I accidentally showed a moment ago and talk about this, because to me, this is one of the most interesting things about the future, because we can see China in the middle of that picture and India on the left with an arrow moving to Vladivostok. What's going to happen here, apparently, is that India will be sending shipping through to Europe by this route. What do you think about this? Do you think this route will ever come into effect? Because the northern route now is water. It used to be ice, but now it's an accessible. I think it's an all year round accessible route for shipping, and it means that Indian products can reach the European market faster than they could coming around Africa or even going through Suez and into the Mediterranean, and that's very good for India. I see a different situation here. I see a situation where India and China can link together and have an overland route to a Russian port, which is basically almost a Chinese port. It used to be. And it's so close to China that they now have an agreement. There's no visas, no passports required. It's basically an open port between Russia and China. So we can see, or I can see China and India linking together to create something very important, which would complement the train systems that run across Europe, from China into Europe. What do you think about that?
Oh, look, it's conceivable. I mean, I think with all of these things, it always boils down to, again, the business case, right? Now, if you're in the business of shipping goods, you're looking for the most cost-effective way of getting things from point A to point B. From India's point of view, it does have a number of options already into Europe. There is the international north-south transit corridor, which runs through Iran up to the Caspian Sea and into Russia, for example. So that gets it into Russia. I mean, not many things get from Russia to Europe at the moment. Certainly not directly. Well, certainly not directly.
That will change shortly. I hope it will.
Well, there's actually plenty of data which shows that a lot of the Central European nations have been fulfilling a very useful transshipment role for European goods to get to Russia and for Russian goods to get to European countries. Now, the interesting thing about that, of course, is that those who are very ardent in their opposition to Russia view this situation as a total outrage, right? That these countries are basically allowing the undermining of the sanctions regime, and that's their view. I guess I take a slightly more detached view, and that is, well, here's another classic example of how sanctions regimes that not everybody's bought into don't work. But look, coming back to this image, the Arctic route is actually going to be an important one, and in part it's because transporting large amounts of things on water remains significantly cheaper than transporting things on land. So the technology, I guess, for transport still takes us to the sea. How that affects India going forward, a lot will depend on the evolution of Indian industry and the kinds of things that India will export largely to the Russian market at the moment. But what's interesting about this little map, Jerry, is there's a lot of ports down that east coast of China.
Yeah.
There's actually no reason conceptually why this sort of network couldn't actually become an incredibly vibrant entrepot to entrepot network of trading hubs. If you turned your mind back to pre-1500 Asia,
the maritime Silk Road.
These were exactly the trading routes that operated, and they actually connected up the world of Persia, Iran, all the way through to China, through the Straits of Malacca, intersecting with India along the way. And in some ways, the prospects of those civilizations reconnecting in a 21st century version of that 600-700 years of trading relationships and civilization exchange, I think is quite exciting. That period of time also showed something else, Jerry, and that is that these three big civilizations, together with a whole bunch of small city-states and smaller civilizations throughout the islands and archipelagos of Southeast Asia largely existed in relationships that avoided significant conflict and bloodshed. There were periodic episodes of conflicts and tensions, but in the grand scheme of things, by and large, these three civilizations, the Indian civilization, the Persian civilization, and the Chinese anchored civilization, all of whom incidentally believed that their civilization was the bee's knees, actually managed to interact with each other without trying to force their civilization onto the next person's.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing how the old Silk Roads was. I mean, there was robbers and robber barons and warlords and stuff like that, but there was never really huge conflict. There was never a Roman Empire conquering everything along its way until the Muslim Empire, basically a Muslim empire, came along from Persia. There's a really interesting history back there.
Look, that whole period of trade between the Persian world and China and India, and obviously all through Southeast Asia, and to some extent actually touching the north of Australia from time to time, I think tells us something about the possibilities of an Asian region in the 21st century that actually doesn't involve the kind of hegemons that people often imagine exist, notwithstanding the sort of American primacy in Asia over the last 30 odd years. Should that go, and in fact, my view is that American primacy in Asia is already gone. It's not going to get replaced by an alternative primacy.
No, it should be replaced by a group of people, a group of nations which, like RCEP, like ASEAN, like the CPTPP, that's really trading nations.
Well, they're the elements that can be pulled together to fashion a 21st century architecture that in many ways draws on the pre-European intersection with Asian historical experience to establish an architecture that really brings together the idea of prosperity through trade as one side of the coin and peace and security being the symbiotic other side. Right? So rather than pursuing merchant interests through war, the pursuit of merchant interests is actually the foundation stones of stability and peace. But you need institutions to deal with this, right? Because when there are squabbles, and people get cranky about things, you've got to have ways of using. You've got to be able to diffuse.
There's a few comments coming in here which are basically saying India is the problem. India is the stumbling block to this. And I think it's not so much India per se, although I see from my perspective India as the problem. But I think a lot of it was related to the fact that India was given boundaries by the British Empire that they've accepted, and then China has said, well, actually, that's part of that's ours, not yours. And those have never been resolved yet. I think if India and China can resolve these things, that's why I showed that picture, because I wanted to show the geography of it. And the fact that if it's shown it with train lines, we would have seen literally hundreds of train lines running across that area, zigzagging all the way across China. And I hope one day straight into India, through the Himalayas and straight into India.
Look, I'm no expert on India, but I do spend a lot of time talking with and listening to Indian friends who have very diverse views, I might add, from pretty hardline nationalists on the one hand through to sort of post-colonial lamenters who lament the missed opportunities of post-colonial India, and everything in between. And I guess, there's often, if there is a common thread amongst all of this, it is that India is still navigating a pathway out of a post-colonial experience.
Mhm.
India had a peaceful revolution, so to speak, is what some of my friends say to me. But in a sense, that's the problem. It never had the cathartic experience that comes from having a serious blue
Yeah.
to purge your body politic, if you will, of a whole bunch of stuff, and to eradicate the negative energies, if you will.
They needed their 1949 moment.
Well, yeah. So some of my Indian friends say that is that India still needs its revolution, and others, of course, don't. But the common thread, when I look across this diverse cross section of friends and colleagues that I speak to, who tell me a lot about their views of India, is that they all believe that India is in a position where it is now finally getting more clarity around its own direction. Some like it, some don't like it, but there is a sense of a much stronger sense of self. So
nationalism, yeah.
So the shadow of colonialism is starting to diminish, not entirely, but it's diminishing. And the disappointing thing for those who work across the India-China space is that for some in India, the relationship between these two countries has become defined basically by 1962. Mm-hmm. And for those who lament this situation, there are those who basically are very hardcore on the issue, but those who lament the situation, of course, see it as an incredible barrier to grasping the opportunities that map of yours kind of showed.
Yeah, I'm on that camp. I know there's a lot of people who are not. I know India is undergoing a resurgence of nationalism. It's undergoing changes under Modi, who will probably be re-elected because he's a popular leader for that country. He's also the leader of the biggest religious group of that country. There's a lot of things about India which make it difficult.
Look, I think India is actually going to be a challenge for the collective West.
Well, India's the next China as well. I mean, if you think about this, if the collective West were able to destroy China's ambitions or China's not ambitions, but China's rise to the top, it's a naturally occurring event. I think then India would be next. That's the way it appears. They're not going to allow America, particularly, not going to allow anybody to overtake them. And not only, I mean, India is where China was 30, 40, 50 years ago, and could easily be in 50 years' time the next China.
Look, one of the interesting things about how the West relates to these countries, whether it's China or India, or indeed Russia, is that it's had a view that the West's mission is to mold and shape and change these countries to become mini-me's.
Yeah.
We saw that yesterday or the day before with Victoria Nuland commenting on, the fact that America didn't get the Russia it wanted. It wanted a Russia that was westernizing and becoming more like America, and it didn't get that. We had Jake Sullivan 3-4 weeks ago, quite up front actually, say once again that America tried for the last so many decades to mold and shape and change China and didn't succeed. Ipso facto, because it didn't succeed, it must now treat China as an adversary. That's an American logical leap, by the way, because there is nothing in the fact that just because somebody didn't change the way you wanted, that makes them an adversary. But that's the American leap.
That's the American leap, yes.
And India is not dissimilar. So the legacy of colonialism obviously left some institutions and things behind. A bureaucracy, a franchise-based electoral system, those sorts of things. But if the West thinks that those ingredients entitles it and enables it to mold and shape India into its own image, then it's going to be sorely mistaken. But of course, it talks about India as if it's one of the club, right? It's the biggest democracy, blah, 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 which of course is a very narrow view of what democracy means. But in doing all of this, the challenge for the collective West is, of course, all the things about India that the West itself knows that if it was anybody else at any other moment in time, the West would find incredibly distasteful. And when you run a values-based foreign policy, at some point, what happens in India becomes a problem for the West.
It should. It ought to. The caste system, the Punjab, the Kashmir, the Muslims, the Sikhs.
Well, there's extensive religious persecution, and I say that I'm not buying into saying India should or shouldn't do this. India's got to find its own path, right? In my view, but from the collective West values-based systems perspective, all of these things are problems, right? So if you're driven by the duty to protect, which of course gets marshaled from time to time to intervene here, there, and everywhere, then religious persecution, slavery, child labour, etc., becomes a problem that the West will find difficult to avoid without ultimately accepting that it runs a hypocritical show. Now, I think that that's what it will do for the next however long it thinks it's useful, right? It'll just accept that it'll run a hypocritical show. It'll talk values on the one hand, deflect these issues on the other, and hope that one day it'll all go away.
Which it won't. So we're coming up, we've just hit an hour, and I said I'd only keep you. I've got one more question. Can I have one more question with you? You're all right?
You can stay here as long as you want, actually, Jerry. I'm okay.
Okay, that's fantastic, because I do have a couple more questions, but this one I thought was, I've got one of the most eminent, can I call you pro-China, or are you China neutral? What's the right way to describe you? Are you pro-China? This is not the question. This is just to establish your bona fides.
Well, I think I'm actually just pro-multipolarity. And
good way to put it. Okay, so I won't put you on the spot like that again, but I can't have a discussion with someone as eminent as you without asking you, when's China going to collapse? We've been hearing it for 20 years or more. We hear it from some fairly renowned people, and even the ABC, our ABC, had something this morning about how it's unraveling in record time. China is just about to collapse. And yet, I'm living here, and it certainly doesn't seem that way. And if I look at the real data that I'm seeing, the real stuff, I'm seeing record spending, record tourism, all back to 2019 numbers and more. So what's really happening? Is China collapsing?
Well, I think China collapsed in 2002.
Right.
I mean, what can you say about some of this stuff? What drives ostensibly intelligent human beings to make these sorts of predictions about things that are patently disconnected from reality? So I think the first thing to try to understand is what it is that even makes these assertions, if you will, possible, and why is it that they're advanced? The other interesting thing, of course, is that we actually have two China tropes, don't we? We have the China collapse, the collapsism trope, and the other one is the China take over the world trope.
Yeah.
Now, it's oil and water, of course. You can't be both. But whichever one it is, there'll be the camps. that China is either going to take over the world or it's collapsing tomorrow or yesterday or last week or whatever it is. And what is all of this about? And what's the intended effects, if you will? The collapsism trope, in many ways, I think, is less about China, but it's more about rejuvenating a sense of belief in the West itself, that in the face of lived experience for many people in the traditional, advanced, wealthy nations, the promise of these nations is no longer being met by the reality on the ground. And in some ways, part of the shadow that hung over all of this is the idea that there's this place called China, which was one going gangbusters. And in fact, our plight is because China has done X, Y, and Z. So China stole the jobs, China does this, China does that. But we can all now be relieved to know that, in fact, all of that's coming to an end. The joint is going to collapse. So how does this argument get pulled together? Well, the current installment of the collapse argument is that the Chinese economy is burdened by, let me see if I can get all of these threads together. It's burdened by wasteful and excessive investment, overcapacity, exploited households that don't consume enough, and deflation as evidence of an economy going into reverse gear. All of which is capped off by a housing industry that is going down the toilet and a share market that has had a bunch of people pull the rug from it. I think that's roughly it.
Yeah, you're forgetting that there's a load of unemployed young people and a load of pensioners coming up as well.
Yeah.
The aging population. I think we got them all there between us.
So what does the evidence actually tell us? Well, the evidence tells us that China's capital stock per capita remains below that of the advanced wealthy countries. There's still room to go in terms of investment. Mm-hmm. And anybody who's traveled outside of the big tier 1 and tier 2 cities in China actually knows this.
Yes.
You go to tier 3, tier 4 cities and townships and villages and the countryside, and it's obvious that there is still a lot of infrastructure that needs to be developed. There's also a need to continue this process so that urbanization continues to unfold. China's urbanization rate's about 65%. It's likely to get to 80. Well, it's likely to get to 80 to 85% in the next 20 years, 15, 20 years. And by that stage, that's sort of where a lot of the advanced economies are at. And that's probably where things will end up. So there's still actually a lot of need for investment. The second trope is China has overcapacity and therefore dumps on the world and this, that, and the other. Makes too much. Well, it does make a lot, and it does export quite a lot of stuff too. And the question is the extent to which this growing capacity to produce things in China is actually meeting the needs of a growing public in China, the requirements of the consumers in China, or is it all going exports? And the evidence again shows that over the course of the last 30 years, the proportion of China's manufacturing output that's exported increased from about 5% through 11%, peaking at 18% in 2004 or thereabouts. And since then, it's slowly tapered back to 13%. In other words, as output has grown, and we know China's output's grown a lot, the majority of that has actually been consumed domestically.
Mhm.
There's no overcapacity, overproduction crisis in this sense of, there's all of these factories that make stuff that's going to get dumped onto the world. China makes a lot of stuff because China is 1/5 of humanity.
That's true.
So what gets made in China, just by proportional terms, is going to be a lot. I often say to friends in Australia that for every one Australian, there is 57 Chinese people.
I've never done that sum, but yes.
So you've just got to have a sense of proportionality about this. And this is happening in motor vehicles, it's happening in manufacturers, you name it. So this idea that China produces too much is largely a furphy. It's also a furphy because it assumes that the global market isn't growing either. It assumes that there is no future demand that will actually absorb this capacity.
Mhm.
And as BRI countries, as Southeast Asia, as Central Asia, as West Asia, as Africa and South America continue to grow, they will be markets for a lot of this stuff. Right? So when Europe and the US fret about this new wave of low-cost Chinese advanced manufacturers hitting their markets, I think they need to calm down a little bit. Consumption in China, the next piece of evidence that's put forward. Right? Weak consumption. Well, in 2023, supposedly a year of woeful rebound from COVID, household consumption increased by 9.2%. Now, if that's weak, then I think a lot of countries will be praying for weak.
Right.
Chinese household incomes have more than doubled in the last 10 years. The income disparity that rose dramatically to about 2010, 2011 has now been coming down dramatically, which actually, for many of the naysayers, this idea of households, the lack of equity between households is a big factor of insufficient demand. Well, that's actually being addressed. Household income as a percentage of GDP has increased from a low of 55% in 2008 to 69% today. Now, in advanced countries, it's in the high 70s, right? But this shift of income is getting back to a position where households are making a greater claim on GDP. So in terms of those key indicators, you'd have to say, well, actually, what China produces, it absorbs mostly. And it absorbs it because households are getting wealthier. Deflation's the latest one, the latest little, sign. Well, if you jumped onto, any, website, of course, and you typed in deflation, you'll get your usual story, which is deflation's bad. And they say it's bad because prices are falling on the assumption that aggregate demand is collapsing. And people who make things are forced to keep dropping their prices, hoping to sell their stuff. But there's a bunch of research actually which shows that the relationship between output growth and price falling is actually very, very weak. So this idea that collapsing prices is related to a collapsing economy is actually a very, very weak proposition historically. And in fact, episodes of deflation have more typically been associated with periods when productivity has been growing, right, in an environment of rising demand and where supply growth is outpacing demand growth. In other words, it's not a symptom of collapse, it's actually a symptom of development.
Yeah.
of growth and intensive competition. That's the other thing. Now, anybody who's been to China knows that the downstream markets for just about anything is super competitive.
Yep.
The price wars that are currently going on around electric vehicles is intense. And in your upstream supply markets, supplying the intermediate goods to all of these industries, the competition's intense as well. So all of these factors brought together actually tells us that China has the good version of deflation at the moment. Right? What's happening in the housing market? Well, the housing market had loans going into it rising up to about 22% per annum growth in 2017. And it was quite clear at that point in time to regulators and policymakers and bankers that there was risk, serious risk of what people would call a Minsky moment, a financial crisis caused by over leverage.
Mm-hmm.
The central banker, the governor of the central bank actually talked specifically in 2018 about the risk of a Minsky moment because money was too easy. There was too much credit. It was too easy to get credit. Xi Jinping actually spoke also about this issue, but in a typically indirect kind of way when he said, look, houses are for living in. They're not for speculating.
Right.
That was a policy message. That was a signal that said, stop speculating here, folks. Stop your leveraging, because if you don't, we're going to do something about it.
Yep. He's pretty much highlighted everything that he's done in every major policy or strategy. He highlighted
Always
it before.
signaled in advance.
Yes. Yeah.
Most players in the property development space actually heeded that message. The ones that didn't went offshore, leveraged up further, and are the ones now
the two that have collapsed. Yes, Evergrande and Country Garden
captured the attention.
Yeah.
But the other problem with the housing industry growing the way it was growing wasn't just that it was highly leveraged. It was that it was sucking a massive amount of national resource into this particular industry at the expense of other industries. So from a productivity point of view, housing construction is low productivity investment. And it created, in effect, what economists would call a Dutch disease, which basically saw a whole bunch of resource, human capital, you name it, pour into one sector and hollow out the other sectors because there weren't enough resources for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the policy intent was to engineer a restructure of what I call the social composition of capital, which is a fancy way of saying we've got too much national resource going into one sector and we've got to get some of it out into other things. And that's been happening. So now we've had the investments in robotics, in EVs, in solar PVs, in data, science and tech, innovation, blah, 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 blah. Mm. So that transition's happening, but you're turning a big ship. So it takes time. So when people talk about, and this is the Verenda article from the ABC this morning, that this is the sign of impending collapse. Well, it's actually a managed deflation of a sector that was overheating.
I agree. That's how I see it too.
Well, and it's total nonsense, right? So that's the next one. The aging stuff's actually a very interesting one, right? And the aging stuff's actually tied up into all of these other things we've been talking about, because as China moves up the value curve through investments in high tech and new tech and all those sorts of things, it's actually creating jobs for highly educated people, number one. It'll mean it'll have less work opportunities for low-skilled people. And it's going to need to, in a sense, export them. It's going to actually begin to import more and more things from other countries. where incidentally it's going to invest in. So it's going to start to take offshore a whole bunch of activities that were established in China 30 years ago as part of its first wave of manufacturing. And it's going to move them offshore. Clothing is already happening, etc.
Yep.
And once you get these transitions happening, the next thing that social resource needs to go to, and this is where the stock exchange comes in, the stock exchange doesn't perform a lot of useful functions in terms of capital for businesses. Once you've listed, you don't actually benefit from the ups and the downs directly. The traders do, but the enterprise itself doesn't.
The CEOs
so from an
do too.
CEOs can too, that's right. So from a retiree's point of view, and this was Australia's lesson in the 1990s. So, talking about the policy innovations that Australia had in that window, it understood that it needed to build a robust retirement strategy to be financed through superannuation. And what's starting to happen in China is the development of and the emergence of essentially supplementary private pensions that people can top up into.
Yeah, that was only legalized a couple of years ago.
Correct. Very recent, a very recent innovation. On the capital market side, in terms of things that people can invest in through these schemes, the reform's starting to happen now too, where licenses are being given to people to create and issue investment products that essentially retirees can invest into to earn incomes on later. Not as speculative shares, but as income earning instruments. And so the big restructure is happening also through the capital markets, where national savings is being channeled out of housing into financial products that will finance the next round of infrastructure, development projects, etc., etc. So this is the stuff that's happening. Now, is it all smooth and easy and 120% successful and all of that? Nothing ever is. We're dealing with humans with imperfect knowledge. Things never move as fast as you want, or they move faster than you want. You don't know a lot of the stuff into the future. But what China's accomplished in the last 10 years is actually quite remarkable, because the other thing that it had to do in this process was actually deal with a financial system that was actually seriously overheating, on the verge of a credit explosion, with private shadow banking running out of control, with a peer-to-peer banking crisis from 2013 to 2016, which you may well remember, where millions of people got ripped off, right? So the financial system was out of control. And to pull it back into control, to take risk out of it, to make sure households weren't getting ripped off, etc., whilst at the same time keeping the machinery of this economy greased and oiled and humming along as it made a radical restructure, and then hit COVID, then hit geopolitical uncertainties. What's been accomplished has actually been quite remarkable. Quite remarkable.
It really is, and it's still hitting all of its growth targets. It hasn't missed one yet. 5.2% growth, and everybody says, "Oh, China's slowing down."
Well, how you account for growth is always interesting, right? Because if you're accounting for growth on the basis of the amount of money people spend on healthcare, which is included in your growth or gross GDP tables, well, America, of course, has an incredible growth engine through its health system. Health expenditure in America contributes 18% to GDP. It's almost twice the global average. Global average is about 10.5%, 11%. But of course, on the key performance indicators that I think matter for a health system, namely mortality rates, infant mortality and longevity, for the first time in 20 odd years, the American population is going backwards. They're dying younger and more infants are dying.
I saw that. The most frightening aspect of that was their life expectancy rate went down during COVID, of course. COVID was a one-off hit, but it's continued this year. Their life expectancy has dropped by, I think, 6 years in the last 3 years, and China's still going up. China had COVID too.
So GDP, which accounts for health system expenditure, is getting a good run in the US.
Right.
But 18% contributes to GDP. So, it's a big system.
Yeah.
But in terms of what the system, from my point of view anyway, what a health system principally should be about, it's not doing as well as it once did. Of course, it's making a lot of money for health system companies and executives and all of that, and adding to GDP as a result. But it's not actually doing what it really should be doing.
Keeping people healthy.
Keeping people healthy and making sure that your next generation of taxpayers don't die on you before they get out of the creche, right?
Or at least do die after they want their social security, which they've paid all their lives for.
So, so in terms of this China collapse trope stuff, the evidence just doesn't go anywhere near giving any legs to any of it. In terms of China taking over the world, it's really about Chinese manufacturing capacity, really. And in the scheme of things, China doesn't export a large proportion of its manufactured outputs. In aggregate, it's about 11% or something from memory. In EVs, it hovers between 15 and 25% over the last 4 years. But there's growth in the world market.
Yeah.
So if America and Europe want to put up the shutters, well, in a sense, they could. And the consequence of that for them, of course, is rising costs for their people for things.
And empty shelves in their shops.
Right. But I think that there's some interesting things happening, Jerry, where the Italian government actually today, it was reported, reached out to BYD to come and do a joint venture in Italy. Okay, so that's an interesting one. And it's a sensible proposition, though I have seen some comments about how terrible it is that the Italian government is now selling out and asking Chinese investment to come in.
Well, the European Union wouldn't like that, and they did just pull out of Belt and Road as well, not that long ago.
Well, which of course always makes these things a little entertaining, really. What was it really done for a spectacle? But the substance of things continues. But of course, Hungary has signed a deal with BYD that they're going to build a very significant manufacturing facility in Hungary. And Hungary is in the EU, right? So it will, by virtue of having its facility there, really use Hungary as a launching pad into the European market.
But did you see where the facility is, where it's located?
Yeah, quite close to
10
Serbia.
kilometers or 10 miles from the border of the EU. Well, it's almost outside the EU.
That's right. Well, Serbia is not in the EU, right? And but there's a tire factory actually about 100 k's on the Serbian side of the border. So I think that there's going to be a lot of synergies get created between Serbia and Hungary that will really revolve around this hub. But the interesting thing about this hub is that it's actually a way in which the things that concern people about the trade imbalances are actually resolved. Right? So if China has a trade surplus with the EU, well, a great way of addressing that structurally is for China to take some of that surplus and reinvest it back into the EU. So the EU is supplying itself.
Yeah, it
And
hasn't
now it might
lost.
be,
Right.
right? Well, and in fact, that's what should happen in the US. So what China's accumulated a lot of US dollar surpluses over the years.
Yes.
And it really can do three things with that, right? It can buy things from America, which it does. It can purchase, well, a few things, four things. It can purchase shares on the stock exchange. It can purchase treasury bonds, or it can invest in America.
But
Buy
Americans don't
land.
want it. Americans don't want it to invest.
That's right. So,
And Australia the same too.
well, so there's the irony, right? So you've got this surplus, and there's concern about this surplus. And the way to resolve the surplus is actually not to stop trade, but for China to bring its US dollars back into America to build factories and all those sorts of things, and to make things for America in America. But the current political environment makes that sensible solution pathway an impossible one.
Yeah.
But that is actually the pathway that will raise living standards, whereas the pathway of tariffs and barriers will actually reduce living standards, but maybe make you feel better.
Do you think that the investments, China's investing a lot in Mexico right now, do you think that is to, as the Americans think, some Americans, politicians in particular, but some academics say, this is because they want to bypass the sanctions and the tariffs by exporting from Mexico into the United States under their American-Canada trade agreement? Or do you think that China's doing this because it sees great opportunities in Central and South America more than it does in North America? Or is it a combination of both?
Well, both. It's like the hub in Hungary. Mexico has a lot of logistics advantages. It's close to the big market in North America, and it also opens up into the markets into Central America. So it's not a crazy place to go and set up a significant amount of manufacturing and distribution capacity.
Right.
Tesla's going there for the same reasons.
Of course, yeah. And it does make sense. It makes absolute sense. And
it makes
as
sense.
those global South countries start to develop, they become the next new markets.
They are the next new markets, right? Yeah. And it's not about pivoting away from the traditional markets of Europe and America, because a lot of the talk suggests that China's making a pivot, and pivot implies switching from one to the other. What's happening is actually not that at all. What's happening is that China is, through its own initiatives, but other people are doing this too, they're actually growing markets full stop. And so you're starting to see these nations that have had the foot on their throat for centuries,
500 years, effectively,
starting to rise and develop demand for goods and manufactured products. And it will take time, because to build industry, you need a lot of infrastructure, you need roads, you need electricity, you need water. But importantly, you also need know-how. Right? So you can transplant a factory somewhere physically, ship the equipment in and lay it out and look like a beautiful factory. And even if it's automated, you'll still need people who can deal with the automation. Right? But you've got to train people to be able to operate all of this. And as they operate this, and this is what we know from how advanced manufacturing works, those small increments of productivity gain that are squeezed out once you've achieved the big productivity gains early in a process happen because of learning by doing. So experienced operators do their own little tweaks that together push productivity to the next threshold. And so it will take a long time, a decade, 2 decades, for these systems to be developed in the developing world, and then for the ecosystem around it to sustain it. The supply chains, the training institutions, and all of those things.
Yeah.
But it's
Remember
happening.
when I first came to China, I met lots of people from Europe and America who were doing things that nobody's doing this anymore. They were building factories. They were building bridges. They were building things in China. That was nearly 20 years ago. Now I do still meet foreigners, but they're either long-term residents or they're here just for a short time to do some teaching or whatever it is that they do. You don't get those kind of expats, where I live anyway, the area in Guangdong, Greater Bay Area. We don't see so many of those people who came here to help China develop. Now China's developed. It seems like it's China that's exporting that skill or those skills that they learned 20 years ago.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what's happening. And in some ways, we've had a whole bunch of brouhaha over foreign direct investment numbers, but a part of that is actually because the retained earnings of all of these factories that have been built over the last 20 odd years, they're no longer getting reinvested in China. And there's a reason for that, because those factories are in the old industries. And those old industries have got their economic advantage traditionally from low labour costs. And as labour costs increased, there was modest mechanisation. But they've basically squeezed as much productivity as they can out of the setup. And all they're doing now is running these factories as cash cows.
Yeah.
They're not going to reinvest in them. They're just going to run them as cash cows.
And the cash they do get, they're taking out because the investment value of taking cash out is very low interest rates in China. They're taking it elsewhere.
Well, they've got nothing to use it. There's no use for it in China, right? And so a company will say, well, I've got a market in Malaysia.
Yeah.
Well, 10 years ago, I might have expanded my factory in China to service the Malaysian market. But it's actually more sensible for me now to go and set up in Malaysia or Indonesia or wherever to service the growing Southeast Asian market from inside Southeast Asia, because it's more economical to do that.
And then export from there back into China for the growing middle-class market that can buy your products.
And that's exactly the transformation that I described, is that as China moves up the value ladder, it's going to have to import these low-value things.
Yeah.
So once you can sort of visualize an economic system that's always in motion, where things are flowing and nodes of activity have to relocate and move in time, you can actually start to see what's going on in China as public policy seeks to engineer, a whole series of interconnected transitions at the same time.
Yeah. I've got one more topic to hit you with tonight, because it's coming up to 20 to 10. I'm very conscious that I'm keeping you late, past normal bedtimes. Last topic of the evening, and really just one question. Central bank digital currency, CBDCs. China's got one going at the moment called mBridge, which I see they're being very quiet about it. It's at Hong Kong, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, I think, and China, just 4 countries at the moment. Do you think this is a kind of future of BRICS? Do you think it's the future of the world? This is really your topic, this digital kind of commercialization. So where are we going with that?
Yeah, look, mBridge is a bank-to-bank project that is to enable settlement of accounts between banks, cross-border transactions. It's not for people like you and me on a day-to-day basis. It's for banks to settle with each other. And the way it works is that the participating banks actually share responsibility for maintaining a distributed ledger. So there's no central bank that maintains records. And historically, different banks have their own records and hopefully reconciled with each other. But with distributed ledger technologies or blockchains, all the participating banks actually share in the same database. And that brings some integrity into this system. So as you say, there are the four main participants together with the Bank of International Settlements, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been 20-odd other central banks from other countries as observers in this project. At the end of 2022, it ran probably its most significant large-scale trial that was announced to the public, with tens of millions of dollars settled across the network, and it worked. The project team upgraded the technology quite significantly last year, and the target is to launch their first minimum viable product, commercial product, to participating banks to be able to use in the real world, so to speak, sometime later this year. Will it be part of the BRICS architecture? Well, there's a good chance that it will. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons is that it's in the schema of things, it's a relatively mature and well-tested architecture. So people understand it. It's not too new. The interesting thing about the BRICS stuff is that there is now a lot of impetus for a settlement system to come into place sooner rather than later. Russia is chairing BRICS this year, and the finance ministers at the last BRICS meeting charged this year's BRICS with coming up with something. And for pretty obvious reasons, Russia has a very strong national self-interest in,
of course,
in moving the de-dollarization infrastructure forward. So I think mBridge has a good chance of being a significant part of that story. Now, that may create challenges for some of the existing participants, including the Bank of International Settlements. So it might not be mBridge per se, but I'm sure that a lot of the learnings from the mBridge project will find its way towards the BRICS multi-currency settlement platform.
Right. So do you think it is the future? Is it the near future, or is it still the far future?
Oh, no, it's the near future.
Right.
It's remarkable how things can move quickly. We often underestimate how quickly things move because so often in life, and particularly when we're dealing with these sort of big institutions and systems, things tend not to move very quickly most of the time. But in the space of 2 years, Russia's trade has pretty much de-dollarized and de-Eurofied within 2 years.
And grown at the same time.
So where there is necessity, people seem to find it in them to move a hell of a lot faster than they would otherwise move.
Right.
So I think that it will move quicker than we probably would think.
So this is another of those American strategies of containment backfiring to actually remove America from a product that they could future use.
Yeah, look, there's a very funny thing going on, I think, at the moment in sort of the global geopolitical system, if you will. And I often describe it by drawing on a medical analogy, which is that what seems to be happening is autoimmunity. So the dominant figures, if you will, the hosts of the system, feel under some threat. as we were discussing earlier. And their response to the threat is things like tariffs and sanctions, etc., and all the way now to very serious discussions around confiscating, in effect, stealing the assets of another country's central bank.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of these things are done in the name of protecting the integrity of the system that they hold dear to their heart. But of course, every time they do this, they're abandoning the features of the system that they hold dear to their heart.
Right.
And this is what autoimmunity does. It actually attacks the system from the inside and kills the host.
It's a really interesting way of describing it. Thank you.
And
that makes it a lot clearer, that the way they're doing that.
And this is why it's difficult, right? Because, and this is the hard part is, the system is changing. It's evolving with a whole lot of reasons why. Efforts to stymie the evolution of the system through these kinds of interventions will actually make the evolution faster. So weaponizing the dollar doesn't protect the dollar. It actually makes de-dollarization more desirable for many. So that's the first thing, it actually hastens things. But the alternative response is to actually go with the flow. But unfortunately, going with the flow actually means that you won't be top dog eventually either. Right? The difference between the two is that you might end up at the same end destination, but one way is a little bit smoother and actually less painful for everyone involved. And the other way is extremely painful for a lot of people. But the way this sort of global system seems to work to me, when you've got big players with big forces at work, lots of economic value flowing, commodities, know-how, and all of that, the general trajectory of these systems are very difficult to change.
Yeah.
You're not going to stop a place like China developing economically. You might retard it temporarily, you might slow it down, you might knock bits of it off balance, but you don't stop something that big. Ditto India. India's actually just too big. It builds up a head of steam. The efforts to stop Russia, I think, should be a lesson for all concerned about how it is that you may wish to deal with behaviours that you may not approve of in the future. And I say all of this without taking a particularly strong moral view either way, just trying to describe a way of dealing with problems that are focused upon the effectiveness of your interventions measured against your desired objectives versus how good it made you feel along the way. Right? And if you're serious about your objectives, then the sanctioning of Russia and all the measures taken as a response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, well, they haven't achieved the outcome. So it tells us something, right? It says that approach isn't working. It doesn't work. So what do? Well, you've got to rethink this. You've got to reimagine other ways of doing business, so to speak.
Can America reimagine, do you think?
America's a very interesting country. There are lots of reasons in the short term why it will struggle to reimagine. It carries the burden of what I often describe as a millenarian zealotry, this sense of religious entitlement and primacy.
Okay.
That manifests itself in this sort of Manichaean or good versus evil framework, where choices are black and white, And that gives elements of the American body politic an incredible amount of energy to pursue what it is that they see as their God-ordained mission on Earth.
What they call their manifest destiny.
Now, regardless of how much failure there is along the way, the lesson that is usually taken out of those experiences is that they're simply not trying enough. So doubling down is the standard response. But there are other traditions in the American body politic that actually suggests that the country's political elite and its system and its people could elect a somewhat different pathway, a pathway that continues to believe and have confidence in themselves, and all countries need to have that, but at the same time focuses a lot more on becoming at peace with yourself by doing good things for your people. Because the problem at the moment, of course, is that an America that isn't at peace with itself is not at peace with the rest of the world. But it's going to take quite a lot of difficulties domestically in America, the health system, and all these things that we see on the news now: homelessness, drug addiction, health crisis on the one hand, and also real pushback internationally against American primacy that says, look, you're a big player here. We get that. We're not in the business of cutting you out, or, as Tony Blinken might say, we're not in the business of putting you on the menu.
Or even eating your lunch.
Yeah. Or eating your lunch. We're in the business of having you at this table. But to be at this table, it's time for you to behave a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And you need these two forces to, in a sense, unfold.
Yeah. I've often talked about America needing a revolutionary change, but not revolutionary in the sense of a revolution. Revolutionary in the sense of they need to do 180 degrees away from where they are. And you're kind of confirming that to me.
Well, it's just an instinct. I mean, I've been to America a couple of times in the last 18 months. And I mean, your question was, can America reimagine it? And well, I mean, it has incredible depth of experience and human capacity to imagine all sorts of things. There's nothing that stops the imagination at some point, reimagining possibilities. What, in a sense, constrains it is the straitjacket of history, but it's the straitjacket of manifest destiny. Right?
Yes, as long as they believe that, they're not going to change anything.
Well, they limit their capacity to imagine because there's no need to imagine anything.
True.
Because it's already preordained. Right? To actually reactivate your imagination actually requires the abandonment of the idea that there's predestiny.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the hard part, I think, for the elite institutions of the American body politic. I actually don't think it's hard for the people on Main Street to actually reimagine possibilities.
Just the people that lead them.
Yeah.
Well,
that's where we're at.
That is where we're at. We've got to almost 2 hours. I didn't think we would go this long. You have been absolutely amazingly insightful, and I've seen several comments that this guest is really good. You've illuminated me in various different ways that I didn't really expect. So I'm very, very grateful for you. And you've sent me lots of stuff while preparing for this, so it helped me to prepare to talk to you. So that's been fantastic. And I'd just like to say thank you very, very much for spending 2 hours of your time with me this evening.
No, look, it's an absolute pleasure, Jerry. I mean,
well, I hope your family can forgive me.
The kids have gone to bed. Everyone's gone to bed, which is why I suggested this time of the night. It's often a time where I actually catch up on things and stuff. So which is why it's not a problem. Look, can I just say that people like me are often caught up in our own particular worlds. Whether it's dealing with research colleagues or with industry, or sometimes people in government and things, but also in think tank colleagues and stuff. And and that's all well and good, but the critical thing about trying to make change is to empower people through information. I often say that you've got to firstly inform people, right, to inspire people so that they can activate their imaginations to create impacts. 4 eyes.
Okay.
And what you do is actually create pathways for people to, I think, firstly become informed. Hopefully it inspires them to think about stuff. And if it activates their own imaginations, then, we're on our way to something. So,
yeah, I'd like to think I have that, but I think you're probably the better teacher than I am. But
well, I don't know about that, but I think we all appreciate the work that you do. It gives us it brings us down to earth in a sense, and I mean that in a good way. So, look, if any of your viewers have got interesting questions or whatever, and you want to follow up with me, I'll do my best to answer them, in the future. And
that would be great. Yeah.
And when I'm back in China, which isn't too far away, and if I'm in your neck of the woods, I'll say hello.
Anywhere in the Greater Bay Area would be fine. I'll make my way to you. We're going to have a bridge to Shenzhen very soon.
I do like Zhongshan. I actually spent a lot of time in Zhongshan in the early parts of the last decade. I had some colleagues and a client actually from Zhongshan who was doing work here in Queensland. So I did a lot of backwards and forwards at the time. There's I don't know whether you know, and this is getting into a bit more chit chat, Jerry, and so if you listen
to go for it.
My local chit chat. But there was near there's a big park called Zimaling Gongyuan.
I know Zimaling, yes.
So diagonally opposite Zimaling Gongyuan will now be a commercial development with banks and all that, and hotels and stuff. That was my friend who did that. And whilst he was doing that project, that particular site was actually an old series of factories. And it was very interesting watching how he transformed that old industrial site into what it is today. So he renovated the factory on the main road into a hotel so that it would continue bringing cash flow income. He'd done a deal with the bus company that had the bus runs to
the airport bus.
The airport bus and stuff. And it stopped at the corner there. So he had people coming.
That's the it was called the Seasons View Hotel. It's now called the Summit.
Yeah, that's it. The Summit. That's exactly it. Then progressively he knocked down buildings behind to build residential towers. There was a KTV and a bar and that sort of stuff there as well, which eventually got knocked. So he did this whole site in stages whilst maintaining revenue flow from the site, because it was a multi-year project. It was a very big project, by Zhongshan standards. So I was very familiar with.
He actually did quite a lot a little further down the road near the old Shangri-La Hotel, which is probably where you stayed back in the day.
I literally stayed in that renovated hotel.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
stayed
yeah.
in there
And
before too.
well,
Yeah.
downstairs on the ground level was a great tea house
Yes.
in those days, and so it was fantastic. And there was also a fantastic foot massage place inside, which you could, because it was an old factory, so there was all these internal stairwells. So we could literally never leave the building and go to the tea
Go
house.
everywhere else.
So
Yeah.
no, so Zhongshan
Yeah.
was is a city that I got to know quite well, and developed a real, well, I've got a soft spot, I guess, for Zhongshan.
It's a nice
Um,
place. It doesn't have the buzz of a Guangzhou. It doesn't have the modernity of a Shenzhen, but it does have a bit of a heart and spirit. I've been here 19 years now, so
yeah,
it's
and
not somewhere I'm itching to get away from.
well, and it does have some pretty spectacular local cuisine as well. It's obviously famous
Yes.
for the pigeon.
Now yeah, the pigeon is great, but you being a Foshan guy, you'd probably be into the Shunda food, which is very,
Yeah,
very
well,
popular.
actually, my grandfather's from Shunda and my grandmother's
Yeah.
from Santre. So I guess, given my druthers, um, uh, if there was a big smorgasbord of all sorts of Chinese cuisine styles, I think I would probably be firstly drawn towards the food from that part of the world.
Yeah.
And
That you just
yeah,
made an interesting comment there, which I think we've got 148 people watching, and I bet you two of them might have understood it. Shady Hazard's from Australia. I think there's a couple of from Australia, but given my druthers, what does that
given
mean to a
given
non-Australian?
my, if I had
Yeah.
the ability to choose.
If I had free choice or freedom, given my druthers, I've never heard that. I haven't heard that in 20 years. There you go.
But no, look, it is a fantastic part of the world.
Yeah.
I've when I was doing a lot of food related stuff, uh, I had the great pleasure and benefit of working with a lot of Australian food exporters, bringing Australian produce into the China marketplace, where we would
Right.
showcase them with restaurants and 5-star hotels, and I got to meet a lot of chefs across China. I actually became quite connected into culinary associations, all the way from Beijing, culinary colleges, and all of that sort of stuff. And as much as all the things we talked about are things that I guess exercise me intellectually,
Right.
the stuff that I've always loved was actually getting into the kitchens with some of these 5-star chefs,
Right.
and actually cooking together and preparing food together for showcase dinners.
Do
And
you know in Zhongshan a restaurant called the Hanxing? It's a basically dim sum. It's very near the TV station and the Boai Hospital. It
not
was
offhand.
okay. It was the largest. It just closed very recently. It was the largest dim sum restaurant in Zhongshan. Very, very famous, very popular. And I think if you were taken anywhere for a yum cha, that's the place you would be
Well, I
taken.
probably would have been there because I
Yeah.
went to Yumcha it was a
Right.
big place where I went.
Yeah, the head chef. Well, they're all big places, but the head chef in there is my wife's cousin. But
Okay.
the owner of it just closed it down. He said, "I've had enough, made enough money." He paid everybody a fortune and closed it down. My wife's cousin is early 50s. He's not going to work again. He's done very well. He worked there 30 years, so he's very happy.
Yeah, look, there's some really interesting models around that stuff,
Mm.
because it goes back to the Dunway system of where your life, in effect,
Yeah.
education, pensions, health, etc., was actually anchored and organised around your workplace
Mm.
and your work unit, and a lot of that practice actually carried over into private enterprises.
Yep.
And I mean, I think Huawei, for instance, is a really interesting example of
Yep.
scaled up, employee owned, a very serious company that's actually owned by its employees.
Yeah, 140,000 employees.
It's
And
remarkable,
the
right?
owner, Ren, only owns 1.3 or 1.4% of the entire company. He's still a
Yeah.
very rich man.
Well, the earlier you join, of course, the greater your benefit as well. So some of the folk who are retiring now, like your the chef, is going to be handsomely rewarded for their years of loyalty to the business and to their co-workers.
Yeah, I think he had some strange rules which benefited people. If you worked there 10 years, you could leave at any time and keep your shares. If you worked less than 10 years, you couldn't. But of course, the incentive is there to stay for even longer.
Yeah.
And it's a good company.
Yeah, look, I mean, that sort of stuff I think is, they're interesting models that, they're difficult to, sure. Look, I've worked on this accent now for 46 years, and I've finally, I think, gotten to a point where it's perfected. English.
It's more than mine.
English was actually my my second language.
Right.
But I have spoken it from when I was born because my father didn't speak any Chinese at all. So when I spoke with Dad and his friends, I always spoke in English. But
is your native language Cantonese or Mandarin?
Cantonese.
Yeah, I thought so.
But my Cantonese, because I don't use it at all, and haven't for a long, long time, is pretty woeful.
Yeah, mine is too.
But I mean, I speak Mandarin every day, for work and personal reasons. So, yes, I've worked very hard on this English accent. So, thank you for the viewer.
You've definitely got it. I was a little surprised to hear how strong it was. And then when you said about give them a druthers, that's just like such an Aussie slang that I haven't heard it in years.
Well, there you go. Yeah. So look, I think, I mean, I'm generally actually hopeful without being excessively optimistic, and I'm largely hopeful because I actually don't think the incentives for conflict are particularly strong. No. People talk a lot about it, and there are folk who drum up lots of fears about it, but actually there's not a lot of reason in this region to do anything for anybody actually to do anything particularly crazy. There'll be chest thumping, I suspect.
Yeah, chest thumping is okay. Peter Dutton's a great chest thumper, and Anthony Albanese's kind of kept a very low profile in terms of his China comments. Both Penny and he have kept a kind of low profile, quiet diplomacy. Is that what they call it?
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, I think it's the biggest trading partner. There's lots of downside to radically disrupting all of that. It's hard to imagine why anybody would go out of their way to do it. Of course, there were some forces that would do that, but there are a lot of downsides. And look, I think, as I mentioned, that window of, say, that decade, the mid-'80s through to the mid-'90s, that window is shut at the moment. And right now, Australia is going through a period where I think it is still having a couple of fairly intensive debates, really. They're not always out there in the public, but it's still actually trying to sort itself out in terms of its relationship to its colonial past. That's one. And it had a bit of an attempt last year, which, didn't achieve the objectives of those who pursued it. It's still trying to resolve a contradiction at the heart of its relationship to the region. So that's partly about itself,
Yep.
but partly about the region. I think it's also, so that's a culture versus geography problem in a sense. And ultimately too, it's obviously trying to reconcile two views of the region that drive two very distinct public policy responses. One view of the region is that the era of American primacy in Asia is over, and that dictates a certain set of responses, which are now encapsulated by the idea of strategic equilibrium and, you know, and all of that. And prior to the election, ideas of multipolarity, regional multipolarity. But the other view is that Australia's interests are best served by either preserving American primacy in Asia, if the belief is that there still is primacy, or if the belief that primacy has been lost, reclaiming primacy. Because that view of Australia's public policy interest basically says that whatever is good for American primacy is good for Australia. Now, Clinton Fernandez has talked a lot about that in his book, Sub-Imperial Power. And in some parts, it reflects this sort of very long tradition in Australia going back to, was it David Walker? He wrote a book about, what did he call Australia? The Anxious Nation. So
I haven't heard of that one.
It's a classic. It's a book about Australia's views of Asia from the turn of the last century through to the Second World War, roughly. And the anxiety at that time about Asia was already there. And of course, coinciding with Federation 1901 was actually the passage of a bundle of legislation that enshrined all the elements of white Australia. So part and parcel of Australia becoming a federation was actually legislating white Australia into the books.
Yeah, making sure it stayed a European country.
So it was an anxious nation, and more recently, of course, we've had the sort of analytical description of Australian foreign policy as foreign policy driven by the fear of abandonment. So Australia's had two great security guarantors, the old DART,
UK,
the UK, and then America. And you bring that sense of an anxious nation in Asia with underpinning this fear of abandonment that some foreign relations scholars have talked about. You know, mix it through with a little bit of sub-imperial assessment, which is, you know, what's good for American primacy is good for us because it deals with our anxieties and it deals with our fear. I think that particular bundle of attitudes is clearly the dominant one at the moment.
If you're talking about mixing that up, and this is absolutely true, when I first arrived in Australia, there was a fear, and it was quite a strong fear. So you've got to add a dollop of fear into this mix-up. But there was quite a strong fear that Indonesia might one day invade us. And I can remember thinking, why would Indonesia want to? I just arrived in Australia, and to me was Indonesia's Bali. That's all I knew of Indonesia at the time. Of course, I knew that coffee came from there and Java and a few other things. But, you know, I didn't know much about it, but I thought, surely Indonesia is not a threat to Australia. But at the time, 1987, people were saying it was a threat. And I guess there's the Timor issues and things like that, which were bubbling. Bougainville was another, West Papua New Guinea. There's all kinds of things going on in that era that caused me to say, well, I didn't realize this. And then a few years later, someone said to me, I remember this very clearly. I remember who said it as well. Indonesia is not our biggest threat. China is. And at the time, we're probably talking when China was just it was a tiny economy, but a massive country. China's the looming threat. We should worry about that. And that was probably going back to about mid-90s. And I hadn't
Yeah.
even thought that China was a threat at all.
So the idea of Australia being swamped by Asian immigrants came onto the landscape in 1996.
There you go.
And that was when Pauline Hanson was elected to the parliament. And she gave her maiden speech and talked about Australia being swamped. I think the words were swamped by Asians or something like that. And look, I often think about these fear campaigns, and fear is an interesting thing because it works best in an environment where people actually don't know much about things. If you know a lot about something, you tend not to fear it that much, or you have a different kind of fear towards it, right?
Or maybe your fear is real the more you learn, but yeah,
that's right.
In the case of China, it's not.
Well, and so the question for me that I guess is interesting is, why is it so easy for these fear campaigns to gain traction in the Australian public imagination? What is it about the makeup of this sort of broad thing of public culture that enables these kinds of fear campaigns to be activated, and for essentially the scab to be peeled away, and for all those things that fear brings with it to, spill out? And if you look at the long sweep of Australian history, post-colonial settlement or invasion, the white settlers have never had a particularly comfortable relationship with Asia in general, but really with China. And we've actually had 3 episodes. We're actually in the middle of the 3rd episode of Sinophobia writ large. The first episode was in the goldfield days, 1860s through to the 1870s. And people can go and read about it, but basically the Irish and the others were pretty cranky with Chinese miners and eventually forced them off the goldfields. And in some places there were some pretty brutal, gang beatings and all that sort of stuff. And as I mentioned earlier, come Federation time, white Australia was enshrined really in legislation as part of the identity of the place. And white Australia basically lasted all the way through to the early 70s. Then we had that little window, which was almost like a sliding doors moment. So maybe it's not a window, it's a sliding door.
Parallel universe.
But Australia didn't quite step through. And, the Hansons and all of those sorts of forces came to the fore towards the end of in the latter half of the 90s. And a different history began to be written. But it was actually a history that drew a lot from the deep xenophobia that has been part and parcel of the nature of the place for the past 150, 200 years. And in some ways, these deep-seated anxieties can often be put away when things are either good or whatever it is. But when there is a disturbance in the environment in which people live, these fears are very easily activated.
Yes.
And that, to me, is probably the greatest challenge that Australia currently has. But it's actually a challenge that affects Australia's relationship with China. What China does is what China does. But these are the things that Australia, I think, is experiencing at the moment. and is also in some ways having a public debate about. There are clearly, look, I think the public debate is clearly asymmetric at the moment.
I've often said this, that I don't think many Australians appreciate that China exports a fair bit of goods into Australia. Import-export Australia is something like 30% of Australia's total international trade, 28, 29%.
Yep.
In terms of Australia's international trade to China, the total is less than 2%. And it's nearly all resources, which can be obtained pretty much anywhere else. It's coal and it's steel and iron ore, and then it's the other resources that come in, gas, which they're getting from America and from UAE right now, and Russia, of course. What people don't realize is that any time China, if it wanted to, could switch off Australia with no effect whatsoever. It's swatting a fly. 2% of its entire industry, entire import-export business would stop. So what would happen to Australia if that happened would be total economic collapse. 30% of their imports and exports would suddenly stop if that were to happen.
The possibilities of that,
zero.
I guess, is well, the probability I think is zero, but the mere possibility of it, of course, underpins some of these fears that people have. But look, iron ore isn't particularly easy to replace at the moment. So coal's a funny one because there are different types of coal. But yes, but you know, it's not something that Australia has a unique supply of. But yeah, look, I mean, any changes to these trading relationships, of course, are disruptive. That's the point, right? This is why they've actually become very sticky. And even in bad times, the trade continues, as we were discussing at the outset. And, you know, look, I think the real thing going forward is, regardless of the view on what the state of Asia is American primacy over and we just have to accept that it's going to be something else? Or the aim is to rebuild American primacy by helping America pursue that objective. That's the fork in the road. And that fork in the road continues to exercise the conflicts and debates that sit at the heart of the Australian Commonwealth Government's policy towards, you know, the world. Because the Department of Foreign Affairs, I think, has a view that is more akin to the former, whereas the Department of Defence and the apparatuses around it, what I often call the insecurity industry.
Yes. And the think tanks.
Well, and all of them, but you know, they're just paid mouthpieces. That's just cash for comment. But the entire insecurity industry of various multi-lettered agencies and all of that stuff, they tend to be of the latter view. How that fork in the road question gets resolved going forward, I think, is going to be quite pivotal to what Australia looks like and its relationship to Asia. The other thing about Asia, Jerry, is I think if we reflect upon that period of pre-European Asia, a far more multipolar, fragmented, distributed environment, the question is what can we learn from that? Especially if we take the former view, which is that American primacy is over and we're heading into something else. And how do we contribute to the shaping of a meaningful multilateral dialogue within the region that can go towards leveraging the institutions that exist already, whether it's RCEP or whatever, you know, and all of that stuff, to design the new architectures of prosperity and peace that recognize these new realities of a China that is now a bigger player than it was 40 years ago. A China that is deeply integrated economically throughout the region. And a reality that not having China at the table is not in the interests of everyone else at the table. But
Anyone,
worse,
that's right.
But worse, making sure that people don't even think that you can put China on the menu, because that is the ultimate folly.
Yeah.
So resolving that fork in the road and then thinking through what it is that an Australia can do as an independent nation in the region to drive a meaningful multilateral architecture.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's the question of the bravery of our national imagination.
Yeah, and it seems to me that the people who are in favor of taking the right fork in the road are all retired. And the people who are in favor of taking the wrong fork in the road, or what appears to me to be the wrong fork in the road, are all still doing the job. And that's a worry.
Yeah, I think it's a really good observation, Jerry, because there is clearly a generational thing going on here. There is no doubt about it.
Yeah,
so the question I have, and I wonder about this, and I don't know the answer, is if the retirees sort of have the perspective, if you will, of that period of the 80s and 90s, which a lot of them I think still do. You can see that in their energy and their ethos. And if the folk who are immediately behind them, sort of the folk who are in their sort of mid-40s through to the late 50s, are part of that insecurity establishment. The question is what's happening with our 20 to 35-year-olds in this country?
Yeah, they've lost their critical thinking skills, some of them, for sure.
Yeah, look, I mean, fortunately in what I do, I get to interact with, people, I guess, who fit that cohort. And there's not a lot of warmongers amongst them, let me put it to you that way.
Good.
But beyond that, I'm not sure that there's a lot of engagement either. And I don't want to say that as too broad a generalization, but certainly from the people within that demographic cohort that I speak to, I haven't come across any gung-ho warmongers yet.
I'm happy to hear that. I got a call, an email actually out of the blue about maybe 3 or 4 years ago that set me pretty much into that community from Dennis Argyle, who passed away a few months ago, a very, very brilliant man. And he basically took me under his wing as my mentor to kind of drive me in a direction that I understood I was being used by him. I don't know if he came from the intelligence community. I know he was a diplomat, but he kind of drove me into what I'm doing today, introducing me to the John Menadews and the John Landers and people like that I now know. And it really was. And I just wrote an article and I hadn't published it. It was on my medium.com, self-published. And he picked it up and saw it and passed it to John Menadew. It got into Pearls and Irritations, and my next 3 years have been involved in that field purely because of Dennis Argyle. That's how it started.
Good, right? I mean,
this is why I observed that most of the people who feel like I do are now retired, including me.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I find that I'm often at the younger end of the spectrum in some of these discussions that I sit in on, which is a concern actually, because these issues aren't going to be resolved tomorrow.
No.
These issues are more than likely going to require a generation or so to find a new landing. And which means that, folk who are in their teens and their 20s need to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, I wonder if they'll be looking at us in the same way that the media now looks at Paul Keating, in a kind of joking, laughable, mocking sense, or they'll be saying, as I do about Paul Keating, he's the only one in the public forum at that level who's actually getting it right. And they shouldn't be laughing at him. They should be listening to this guy. I wonder which way it'll go.
I think that there's a couple of things about Keating's interventions. One is the content of what he says, and the arguments that he's articulating, and the issues that he's putting on the table. And they're issues of substance. The second thing is that he's actually created a space that I think has given a lot of other people some courage that perhaps they didn't have 18 months or 2 years ago. Well, you've seen that with a lot of his former cabinet colleagues who were relatively quiet around a number of these critical issues, AUKUS and other things, who then became animated after Keating's last appearance at the National Press Club. And creating a space where people who might have held those views, but until he created a space, felt a little bit frightened to articulate those views. He's performed an important service.
I think so too.
Not only with the content of what he said, but with the fact that he's created a space that enables those who don't share in whole or in part the views of the insecurity industry, the opportunity to articulate something else.
It's very strange. I guess I'm quite outspoken about it anyway, but I tend to get quite a lot in Australia. I get mocked. I've been written about in ABC and a couple of other things. Sydney Morning Herald did an article on me. These kinds of things, they don't bother me at all, but I'm in China. Nothing can hurt me here. And I'm not setting foot back in Australia until things are better. I'm a little afraid of what might happen if I set foot back in Australia. But the fact is, I'm finding that there doesn't seem to be inside of Australia a tremendous amount of support in any media or public forum. There's a lot in private, there's a lot in social media, but people like yourself, but there's not in the public forum where the media is actually mass media. And that's the biggest problem, is it's getting our message, my message, Paul Keating's message, into mass media. And I guess he's achieved that.
Yeah, look, I think that there's a demographic issue here as well, right? And the relationship that people have to the traditional mass media really tracks according to your age group.
Right.
The older you are, the more you tend to trust the traditional institutions of the mass media. And the younger you are, the less you do. And you also the younger you are, you also don't absorb or get your information and your news from any of those sources anyway. So this new space, if you will, this independent media space, alternative media space, actually does have the potential to inform more people than you might think. And it's not necessarily what one channel does, but it's actually the aggregate of all of these different channels, because it's a much more fragmented environment. So rather than there being a single masthead, in a sense, this platform's the masthead, and you've all got your own channels in that. Right? So as people start to navigate their way through a range of channels and hear the unique independent voices of individuals, they will actually start to develop a different picture from the one that you would otherwise get if you just consume your news from your mainstream news sources. Now, there's good things about that, and of course there are bad things about that. I mean, the good things about that is that alternative voices and alternative information that's often excluded from mainstream reportage actually can be talked about. And frequently, the problem with mainstream media is not just the spin that they might put on things. It's actually the willful act of omission.
Yes. Yeah.
Either within a story itself or actually just not running a story about something. But it's increasingly hard to ignore things happening in the world because information will get out somehow, somewhere. And that's
I made this very point today. I made a video today where it's important to listen to what the media are not telling you. They will say, for example, that the Xinjiang narrative, which is a completely fake story. The Xinjiang had problems, but it didn't have persecution, it didn't have genocide, it didn't have cultural, none of those things. And I know this because I've been there, seen for myself, talked to people in the region, traveled extensively. This is not just my opinion. These are, I mean, I can prove this from actually communication with the people. At the end of the day, the media is saying the Islamic world is suspiciously quiet about this. No, it's not at all. If you pick up the Middle East Monitor, you pick up Al Jazeera, you pick up any Iranian, any Indonesian, many of the Muslim countries, Malaysian as well, they're all saying the same thing. But we're not reading their media. We're reading the media that's saying, no one's saying a thing about this. But in fact, it's completely the opposite. The truth is out there. It's just not being published in mainstream English language media or German or French for that matter.
And look, there's another side to all of this too, and that is that often people who, I guess, don't like the content of the mainstream narratives often also feel that the alternative narratives aren't getting anywhere. Like, so, you know, we touched on it in terms of, you know, the reach and all of that. But I also think that sometimes we can live inside our own English language mainstream media bubble as well, where our reference points are just the propaganda that's being fed out there, and you know, you get sort of agitated by that, or you can feel down about it, or angered about it, or whatever it happens to be. But there's actually a much broader world out there.
Yes, yeah, I'm finding it.
And that broader world is no longer taking what is published in the old mastheads of truth. They're no longer taking that as written. You know, they're not accepting that as a truth point. And you see that in the trust data. So all the consumer surveys around trust in media all confirm this now.
Yeah, nobody trusts media, but they believe everything they want to believe about China.
Well, they believe that already.
Yeah.
Right. And that's my point about the deeply ingrained parts of, you know, a popular culture. This is why this stuff's easy. If you want to run a scare campaign about certain things or a certain group of people, it's actually quite easy because they already believe it anyway. And really, you're literally picking at the scab, right? But it's there. Right? You're just picking at the scab and letting it out.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot you can do about that in the short term. It's the people who don't have too much in the scab, or who are actually just in a different space altogether, that you've got to reach. And you will come back around to the others. You know, I mean, changing people's views of things takes a lot of time and effort, because we all have a tendency to be, well, we all do, but we can all be a little bit closed about.
True.
Things. And so changing those perspectives is actually quite difficult. But I guess my thinking around all of that is largely to not be too frustrated by that, but just realise that you've got to just work on the audiences that you can.
Yeah, the thing that I find with that, it kind of motivates me. It inspires me to be a little bit better. I'm quite often challenging people, and I get the accusations, you must be paid by the CCP, as it were. Yeah, okay, well, if I'm paid, what's wrong with what I said? Doesn't matter if I'm paid or not, if it's true. That's one aspect. And then I get the guys telling me, you're a liar. Well, okay, which aspect have I lied about? And can you show me? So I'm constantly challenging people. I love to see these people come in, because the simple fact is, you're making a statement, you're attacking me personally, you're not attacking my message. What does that tell me about you? And what does that tell me about your knowledge of this situation? So go away, do some research, prove me wrong, and then maybe I'll retract or make an apology and make a correction. But until you can do that, all you're doing is hurting your own credibility, not mine. So that's the way I tend to look at it.
Yeah, I think it's a healthy attitude, right?
Yeah.
So, you just got to keep plugging away and learn, right? You're learning new things all the time.
This is the statement that I often make. I wish I was paid by them.
Well,
just keep going with it.
Look, these are funny debates, right? Where the level of intensity that seems to come up from people is quite incredible, and we can all be guilty of it from time to time as well. So I'm certainly not suggesting that I'm not inside the glass house of intensity from time to time, but one of the things that I guess I often try to say to people is, look, it's understandable that you have a very strong passion about something. We get that. And in fact, there's probably good arguments to say that people with passions about things are leading a richer life anyway than those who don't. So that's great. You're getting out of bed with a fire in your belly about something. And it just so happens to be something that I may or may not agree with. But you've got some fire in your belly. But I find it very odd that people sort of need to feel like they have to have this particular amount of fire in their belly about another country.
Right, yeah.
That to me is an odd thing. I don't quite get why people do. It's a bit like that discussion we were having earlier about how India is going to become a problem for those who've got a very strong values-based approach to the world. Right? But if you choose not to let those values always intercede in the way that you deal with other people, then it is less of a problem.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that you mightn't have a personal view about it, but you actually just contain that and you sort of cultivate your behaviour in a way that doesn't let that get in the road. And I say that because I look at human societies all across this planet, and groups of people coming together, societies, are actually quite a remarkable experiment in that they are seeking to advance the quality of the life of that group of people, trying to understand the world around them so that they can protect themselves and improve themselves. And every time they do something, they often solve one problem and create 4 new ones. And so in many ways, the shared human experience is we're trying to find ways that we can live together, not kill each other.
Yeah.
And advance things that are of common interest to each other. Now, we have lots of ways of doing that, right? Different groups of people have developed and evolved different ways of dealing with disputes and differences of opinion and all of that. Right? But the underlying driver is trying to address this need of a collection of people, small and large, to tackle things that they have in common. These are problems that this group of people have in common. And they need to find ways of dealing with them, sometimes with more success, sometimes with less success. And what it is that causes someone else from outside of one group to have a lot of fire in their belly about what another group's doing.
Yeah.
I find it just a little bit, well, it's a bit odd to me.
Psychologists have the answer. I studied a touch of behavioral psychology, and the answer is basically that when we don't understand something, we consider it strange. And if we consider it strange enough, we could become aggressive towards it.
Yeah.
And it is just basically cultural psychology, national identity.
So, you asked me before about America. I think America's got a lot of challenges today. But at the same time, like all big collections of people, it will draw on the resources of its history and its experiences and all of those things to try to address them. Yeah, sure, it has consequences on others along the way, but nonetheless, this is what human societies do. China's doing the same. We spent an hour talking about the problems that the government there has been tackling over the last 10 plus years, and the restructuring and all of these things, right? These are all efforts made with the tools available and the constraints that exist through history and institutions and culture and all those things to try to solve certain problems to achieve certain things. Now, Australia's doing the same. Well, Australia's doing the same. We've got these forks in the road. I think that diagnostics is, well, certainly I think that diagnostics is giving some insights into the challenges Australia faces. But, they're just problems that societies have. And, I'm not going to get worked up about whether America is doing the right thing by itself, other than to say, hey, pal, maybe it would be worthwhile spending a little bit more time and effort dealing with the problems and challenges in your own backyard before coming and lecturing everyone else on what they should or shouldn't do. That's probably, generally the extent of what I'd say. I'm quite happy to say that have a much stronger view about Australia.
I get a little critical of America and people, and I really I should temper my criticisms of America. The reason I am critical of America is because what I see is not so much that America is bad. It has its problems, but what it's doing is it's projecting and deflecting at the same time. And all I'm trying to do is point out that while they're saying, look at what they're doing over there, we wouldn't do that. They're actually doing it. There's the projection. And then the deflection.
Well, hypocrisy is a problem, right?
Yeah.
So this is pointing and exposing hypocrisy. And as I mentioned earlier, an America that's not at peace with itself is not at peace with the world. But I think you can say that with lots of countries too, right? When a country is not at peace with itself, it's always going to be projecting dysfunctionally externally, whether it's aggressive or irrational or whatever it happens to be. It's just not a happy camp.
Including China, for its 100 years of humiliation, as they call it, it had that same problem. It wasn't at peace with itself. It had a revolution, then it had a civil war. It almost had a democracy, almost. But when I say democracy, an American-style democracy is probably a better way to describe it. Well, it almost had an
electoral franchise, right? A multi-party electoral franchise system. But again, those things are systems that groups of people adopt and use to resolve differences of opinion.
Reach outcomes.
To try to do something as a collective of people. Right? So it's just a set of institutions and tools. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And the volumes of literature that you actually get pointing out the limitations and failings of so-called, well, let's call them parliamentary democracies, is extensive. It's not like people are ignorant of the significant problems and limitations of parliamentary democracy. And I know what the standard retort is. Well, as problematic as it is, it's still the best of all the systems. Well, it may or may not be, right? It depends on where you are. But if it's a system that's run by a lot of money, or it's a system that basically causes an elite to become totally detached from everyone else, well, it's actually just not very good, period. Right?
It's not.
Because it's going to create its own problems. Right?
I brought this up, this comment, I brought this one up because a lot of people don't know this. I only recently found this out reading a book in China. In fact, I'm still reading the book in China. Why and how the CPC works. You can see I've got a few notes. What happened with that? I was reading through that book and I got one of these watershed moments. My God, I didn't know this. Roosevelt sent a guy called Patrick Hurley to China in 1944 before the war was over, and he met with Chairman Mao, who was not Chairman Mao at the time. Mao was the leader of the opposition, but they were kind of put their differences aside to fight a war. And what happened was Roosevelt, as a result of the Cairo Declaration in 43, a year before, had said, when China wins the war in Asia, then the KMT would get control of back from Taiwan, get Taiwan back, and get their 11-dash line and all the waters that they claimed. All of that would be done, and that was going to happen. But they needed to cooperate with the other party. Otherwise, there'll just be a civil war. And so apparently the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek, agreed to this. Then, 1944, Patrick Hurley came to China. He met with Mao. They sat down, nutted it out, wrote a five-point process by which the KMT and the Communist Party and any other party that had been involved in fighting the Japanese would form a coalition government for the first period, which would then break up into a multi-party democracy, American style. And it was agreed to by every single person except one. And it wasn't Mao, surprisingly. It was Chiang Kai-shek wouldn't agree to it. That's why we had a civil war in China. Simple as that. So American-style democracy almost came. God knows what would have happened, but it could have been a very different world.
Well, who knows, right? And the other thing to remember is that the Civil War is actually not over.
No, because Taiwan is still over there and we're over here.
Well, it's an unfinished civil war. There's no armistice, no peace treaty, nothing. So that's where it's at. And again, there's a lot of contemporary discussion about Taiwan that in many ways forgets that very foundational fact. We could have a very long discussion about Taiwan on another occasion, but it's for a different day. And even Australia now is coming out with words like, we acknowledged one China, but we never said Taiwan was part of it. Yes, you did. So it's all starting to change. The word acknowledged and recognize China's PRC, China's claim, but don't recognize Taiwan. Look, it reminds me of high school kids, pretending to be lawyers, nitpicking and passing words, and if the state of public discourse on this particular issue, boils down to what is in effect a relatively schoolboyish argument over, the meaning of a word.
Yes.
And I think we've missed
the spirit of the agreement.
Well, and what the big issues are in terms of addressing the issues going forward.
Yeah.
Uh,
And there
but
are issues, and they do need to be addressed.
Of course, and again, this goes back to what I was just saying. These are groups of people with complex problems that often have lots of history to them. Memories, of course, come and go. Circumstances change, and people need to find ways to move forward. Now, when you have groups of people who've been fighting with each other, even if they've halted the fighting for quite a long time,
70 years,
finding a pathway to a reconciliation, right, is still a lot of work, and it's not easy. It's not guaranteed to be successful on the first go, or the second go, or the third go.
Well, Mao was said to have, or quoted to have said, "We'll wait 100 years," and I think Deng might have changed that to 1,000 years. But the fact is, people in China would like it. If it happens, it would be great, and I think a lot of people would like to see it in Xi Jinping's time. But even he is pragmatic about it. He's never said it has to happen. Nobody in China is saying that. It's only America.
Yeah, and let things unfold as they will unfold.
That's right. It'll come to its justifiable conclusion one day. Yeah. And it may have. It will. I don't think it will ever be a restart of the Civil War, but it may be if the Civil War will be over very quickly. I'm fairly sure. If China did decide that they're going to defend Taiwan from being taken away, that's the only way a war would happen. Is if China needs to defend it, I think.
Yeah, and look, people in many ways are very basic too. They just want to get on with their life, and and
in Taiwan and on the mainland.
That's right, and I actually think by and large most of the politicians on both sides of the straits also understand that too. Yeah, that first and foremost, people want to get on with their lives. That's because if you can't enable that, then you're going to create the conditions for a whole bunch of social instability and unpredictable outcomes anyway. So it's always it has been for a long time the first obligation. So that's the first thing. I mean, I think that there's still some water to flow under the bridge in Asia. I
think I don't think it'll ever change. Certainly not in our lifetime. We're not going to have. I thought about 30, 40 years ago, when the European Union was just forming from the common market into the European Union, my thoughts were, this is interesting because maybe one day we'll have complete peace and stability throughout Europe. It's turned out to be the complete opposite. It doesn't work that way. You can have your trading relations, but you can't always have your political affiliations all working together.
Yeah. Well, interesting lessons. So
and on that subject of interesting lessons, since we cannot fix the Taiwan-China dispute, should we call that a night?
Let's call it a night.
We're rapidly approaching the 3 hours. I've never
crazy.
done it. This is a marathon. But,
well, the last hour was really a lot of chit chat.
It was really interesting, though. Thank you very much. And we've been up over 150 viewers for pretty much the last 2 hours. So that's people come and go. There's a lot of people who've been in to see us, and that's been fantastic.
Oh, good.
And you mentioned before, if you're listening now and you have further questions for Professor Warwick Powell, please put them in the comments section. I do go through all the comments, and let me know, and we'll get back together. I think probably the next time less political and more social, because I'd love to hear about your experiences in China.
Food, tea,
Food.
hiking in southwest China.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you're talking Yunnan or Sichuan?
Yunnan and Sichuan. I've hiked
Lovely.
between Dali and Lijiang, for instance.
Wow.
With a mule team. And
interesting.
And staying with literally in camps and tents on the plateaus each night.
Interesting.
And,
Let's talk about that.
Up the
there was a guy who had the unfortunate name of Morrison, a Dr. Morrison, who walked from Chongqing to Burma, Myanmar now. You know that story.
A lot of the plant hunters and things all were through there. And but look, there's a beautiful part of the country. There's lots of beautiful parts of the country, and
you're right.
And lots of fun things to talk about too. So let's talk about some
social
things next time.
Let's get back in a month or so.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
All right, great. All right. Thank you, Warwick, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's been a fantastic show.
Crazy.
Very, very good.